Chapter 3, Part 2. Hours later, the common room had a warm, jovial feel to it. Coat was kneeling on the hearth, building up the fire, when someone spoke behind him. "Quoth?" The innkeeper turned, wearing a slightly confused smile. "Sir?" It was one of the well-dressed travelers. He swayed a little. "You're Quoth." "Coat, sir," Coat replied in an indulgent tone that mothers use on children and innkeepers use on drunks. "Quoth the bloodless." The man pressed ahead with the dogged persistence of the inebriated. "You looked familiar, but I couldn't finger it." He smiled proudly and tapped a finger to his nose. "Then I heard you sing, and I knew it was you. I heard you in Immer once. Cried my eyes out afterward. I never heard anything like that before or since. Broke my heart." The young man's sentences grew jumbled as he continued, but his face remained earnest. "I knew it couldn't be you, but I thought it was. Even though. Who else has your hair?" He shook his head, trying unsuccessfully to clear it. "I saw the place in Emmer where you killed him, by the fountain. The cobblestones are all shattered." He frowned and concentrated on the word. "Shattered. They say no one can mend them." The sandy-haired man paused again. Squinting for focus, he seemed surprised by the innkeeper's reaction. The red-haired man was grinning. "Are you saying I look like Quoth? The Quoth? I've always thought so myself. I have an engraving of him in back. My assistant teases me for it. Would you tell him what you just told me?" Coat threw a final log onto the fire and stood. But as he stepped from the hearth, one of his legs twisted beneath him, and he fell heavily to the floor, knocking over a chair. Several of the travelers hurried over, but the innkeeper was already on his feet, waving people back to their seats. "No, I'm fine. Sorry to startle anyone." In spite of his grin, it was obvious he'd hurt himself. His face was tight with pain, and he leaned heavily on a chair for support. "Took an arrow in the knee on my way through the Eld 3 summers ago. It gives out every now and then." He grimaced and said wistfully, "It's what made me give up the good life on the road." He reached down to touch his oddly bent leg tenderly. One of the mercenaries spoke up. "I'd put a poultice on that, or it'll swell terrible." Coat touched it again and nodded. "I think you're wise, sir." He turned to the sandy-haired man, who stood swaying slightly by the fireplace. "Could you do me a favor, son?" The man nodded dumbly. "Just close the flue." Coat gestured toward the fireplace. "Bast, will you help me upstairs?" Bast hurried over and drew Coat's arm around his shoulders. Coat leaned on him with every other step as they made their way through the doorway and up the stairs. "Arrow in the leg?" Bast asked under his breath. "Are you really that embarrassed from taking a little fall?" "Thank God you're as gullible as they are," Coat said sharply, as they were out of sight. He began to curse under his breath as he climbed a few more steps, his knee obviously uninjured. Bast's eyes widened, then narrowed. Coat stopped at the top of the steps and rubbed his eyes. "One of them knows who I am," Coat frowned. "Suspects." "Which one?" Bast asked with a mix of apprehension and anger. "Green shirt, sandy hair. The one nearest to me by the fireplace. Give him something to make him sleep. He's already been drinking. No one will think twice if he happens to pass out." Bast nodded, thought briefly. "Nijmegen?" "Menke." Bast raised an eyebrow, but nodded. Coat straightened. "Listen 3 times, Bast." Bast blinked once, and nodded. Coat spoke crisply and cleanly. "I was a city-licensed escort from Raelian, wounded while successfully defending a caravan, arrow in right knee, 3 years ago. Summer. A grateful Caldish merchant gave me money to start an inn. His name is DeLoe. We were traveling from Purvis. Mention it casually. Do you have it?" "I hear you 3 times, Reshi," Bast replied formally. "Go." Half an hour later, Bast brought a bowl to his master's room, reassuring him that everything was well downstairs. Coat nodded and gave terse instructions that he not be disturbed for the rest of the night. Closing the door behind himself, Bast's expression was worried. He stood at the top of the stairs for some time, trying to think of something he could do. It's hard to say what troubled Bast so much. Coat didn't seem noticeably changed in any way, except perhaps that he moved a little slower, and whatever small spark the night's activity had lit behind his eyes was dimmer now. In fact, it could hardly be seen. In fact, it may not have been there at all. Coat sat in front of the fire and ate his meal mechanically, as if he were simply finding a place inside himself to keep the food. After the last bite, he sat staring into nothing, not remembering what he had eaten or what it tasted like. The fire snapped, making him blink and look around the room. He looked down at his hands, one curled inside the other, resting in his lap. After a moment, he lifted and spread them, as if warming them by the fire. They were graceful, with long, delicate fingers. He watched them intently, as if expecting them to do something on their own. Then he lowered them to his lap, one hand lightly cupping the other, and returned to watching the fire. Expressionless, motionless, he sat until there was nothing left but gray ash and dulling gray coals. As he was undressing for bed, the fire flared. The red light traced faint lines across his body, across his back and arms. All the scars were smooth and silver, streaking him like lightning, like lines of gently remembering. The flare of flame revealed them all briefly, old wounds and new. All the scars were smooth and silver, except one. The fire flickered and died. Sleep met him like a lover in an empty bed. The travelers left early the next morning. Bast tended to their needs, explaining his master's knee was swollen quite badly, and he didn't feel up to taking the stairs so early in the day. Everyone understood, except for the sandy-haired merchant's son, who was too groggy to understand much of anything. The guards exchanged smiles and rolled their eyes, while the tinker gave an impromptu sermon on the subject of temperance. Bast recommended several unpleasant hangover cures. After they left, Bast tended to the inn, which was no great chore, as there were no customers. Most of his time was spent trying to find ways to amuse himself. Sometime after noon, Coat came down the stairs to find him crushing walnuts on the bar with a heavy leather-bound book. "Good morning, Reshi." "Good morning, Bast," Coat said. "Any news?" "The Orson boy stopped by. Wanted to know if we needed any mutton." Coat nodded, almost as if he had been suspecting the news. "How much did you order?" Bast made a face. "I hate mutton, Reshi. It tastes like wet mittens." Coat shrugged and made his way to the door. "I've got some errands to run. Keep an eye on things, will you?" "I always do." Outside the Waystone Inn, the air lay still and heavy on the empty dirt road that ran through the center of town. The sky was a featureless gray sheet of cloud that looked as if it wanted to rain, but couldn't quite work up the energy. Coat walked across the street to the open front of the smithy. The smith wore his hair cropped short and his beard thick and bushy. As Coat watched, he carefully drove a pair of nails through a scythe blade's collar, fixing it firmly onto a curved wooden handle. "Hello, Caleb." The smith leaned the scythe up against the wall. "What can I do for you, Master Coat?" "Did the Orson boys stop by your place, too?" Caleb nodded. "They still losing sheep?" Coat asked. "Actually, some of the lost ones finally turned up. Torn up awful. Practically shredded." "Wolves?" Coat asked. The smith shrugged. "It's the wrong time of year. But what else could it be? A bear? I guess they're just selling off what they can't watch over properly, them being short-handed and all." "Short-handed?" "Had to let their hired man go because of taxes, and their oldest son took the king's coin early this summer. He's off fighting the rebels in Manat now." "Menares," Coat corrected gently. "If you see their boy again, let him know I'd be willing to buy about 3 halves." "I'll do that." The smith gave the innkeeper a knowing look. "Is there anything else?" "Well," Coat looked away, suddenly self-conscious. "I was wondering if you have any wrought iron lying around," he said, not meeting the smith's eye. "It doesn't have to be anything fancy, mind you. Just plain old pig iron would do nicely." Caleb chuckled. "I didn't know you were going to stop by at all. Old Cobb and the rest came by day before yesterday." He walked over to a workbench, lifted up a piece of canvas. "I made a couple extras just in case." Coat picked up a rod of iron about 2 feet long and swung it casually with one hand. "Clever man." "I know my business," the smith said smugly. "You need anything else?" "Actually," Coat said as he settled the bar of iron comfortably against his shoulder, "there is one other thing. Do you have a spare apron and set of forge gloves?" "Could have," Caleb said hesitantly. "Why?" "There's an old bramble patch behind the inn." Coat nodded in the direction of the Waystone. "I'm thinking of tearing it up so I can put in a garden next year, but I don't fancy losing half my skin doing it." The smith nodded and gestured for Coat to follow him into the back of the shop. "I've got my old set," he said as he dug out a pair of heavy gloves and a stiff leather apron. Both were charred dark in places and stained with grease. "They're not pretty. They'll keep the worst of it off of you, I suppose." "What are they worth to you?" Coat asked, reaching for his purse. The smith shook his head. "A job would be a great plenty. They're no good to me or the boy." Messing up my words. The innkeeper handed over a coin, and the smith stuffed them into an old burlap sack. "You sure you want to do it now?" the smith asked. "We haven't had rain in a while. The ground will be softer after the spring thaw." Coat shrugged. "My granda always told me that fall's the time to root up something you don't want coming back to trouble you." Coat mimicked the quaver of an old man's voice. "Things are too full of life in the spring months. In the summer, they're too strong and won't let go. Autumn," he looked around at the changing leaves on the trees. "Autumn's the time. In autumn, everything is tired and ready to die. Later that afternoon, Coat sent Bast to catch up on his sleep. Then he moved listlessly around the inn, doing small jobs left over from the night before. There were no customers. When evening finally came, he lit the lamps and began to page disinterestedly through a book. Fall was supposed to be the year's busiest time, but travelers were scarce lately. Coat knew with bleak certainty how long winter would be. He closed the inn early, something he had never done before. He didn't bother sweeping. The floor didn't need it. He didn't wash the tables or the bar. None had been used. He polished a bottle or two, locked the door, and went to bed. There was no one around to notice the difference. No one except Bast, who watched his master, and worried, and waited. End of chapter 3.